Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Dario Hlynur, and of course down the line we have my good friend Dr. Neil Fox. Neil, really good to see you.
You too, mate. You too. How are you doing?
I'm very, very well.
Excellent.
In fact, what can I tell you? You know, it's I feel like when you have these sort of feelings and contentment and just relaxation. I feel like we come on an awful lot and decry the state of the world and checking our privilege, but still moaning about this, that, and the other. But yeah, I just think that the weight of the term has kind of lifted now. I've had a lot more time to get back into getting healthy and getting in shape. I'm sort of exercising regularly, walking, tennis a couple of times a week. I haven't had a drink for like a month, and I just feel in myself a lot better. I think I was sort of, when the term was at its heaviest, I think I was sort of using alcohol a little bit too much to sort of self-medicate and unwind at the end of the day, and I just wasn't feeling it at all. And so feeling good sort of in myself, and that's helping with the mental aspect as well. But I'm not going to go on too much about that because, this is not a fitness guru podcast, and I can feel our listeners rolling their eyes out there in the ether. But how about you? How are you doing?
Similar, really. Yeah, I mean, it's nice to hear that. I think our listeners do. They want to know that it's not always doom and gloom. And yeah, I feel the same. I was talking to someone the other day about, and I'm going to name drop Laura Mulvey, about this thing called Paradise Syndrome, where everything's too good to be true. You're just convinced that something is coming around the corner. So Beth and I obviously moved into this house in Falmouth, and just feeling like something bad must be coming because it feels really good at the moment. We love living here, we love the house, the kids are well, life is good. And then it's like, well, something bad is coming. And it feels weird after a sort of challenging year to be in that position. But it's important to try and enjoy it when it's there and sort of carry those feelings. But yeah, so I think that's it's just nice to hear. So yeah, I'm doing all right. Work is chaotic, but life is good.
Yeah, I mean, the only disappointment is the fact that we're not in the same room, which obviously you had some car issues and various other issues. But it's one of those things. We crack on and we're here on online, and we've both seen quite a bit of cinema. And I think after the last episode, which was a long time in the making, a lot of work, it's nice to have one of our regular debriefs about a couple of films, or deep dives maybe is more accurate, about films that we've seen recently. And we've both seen quite a bit. There's quite a lot sort of streaming and in the cinemas at the moment that's kind of worth catching, sort of prize winning films from last year out at the cinema in the European art house sense, festival sense of winning prizes. So it's been nice to catch up with them both at the cinema and at home. I do have a story about a complete schoolboy error in terms of trying to get to the cinema yesterday, but I'm going to save that for the bonus. So if anybody wants to hear my travails of trying to get to the cinema on a Sunday afternoon, they can tune into the bonus. And just on that as well, just to welcome, we've got a new Patreon member, Connor Bullen. Thanks very much, Connor, for joining us at the 450 membership. So you've got a tape bag winging your way as soon as you give us your address. But thanks again to you and to all our Patreon subscribers who are continuing to support the podcast. But yeah, it's good to talk, even though we're not in the same room.
Absolutely, yeah. So see, that's how strange, isn't it? Life is so good. I didn't even acknowledge the fact that I had a whole trip cancelled because of someone smashing my wing mirror off the side of my van outside the house last week. So that's probably a good sign. But yeah, it's really disappointing to not be doing this face to face. Hopefully, it won't be too long before that happens again. But yeah, it is nice to just be able to reflect on some films, and particularly for me, because I think one of the films I saw in the cinema, which I think is a rarity. I literally cannot remember the last time I was in a cinema. So that feels nice to be able to reflect on that. And I was as I was leaving the film, I was like, when was I last in a cinema? So I just actually couldn't remember. So yeah, really excited to do that. And yeah, to talk about a couple of films which were kind of on the radar from last year, but are sort of here. And weirdly, just they both played at Cannes and won at Cannes, and sort of seen them just as the new Cannes ramps up, which tells you how long it still takes for certain films to filter through from their first festival appearance. Yeah,
absolutely. So, not to keep our listeners in suspense, well, if you've seen the show notes for the show, you know what films we're talking about. So we're going to talk about Godland and, first of all, Close. And I think just watching these films as an overview before we start, and a couple of other films, including the Eight Mountains, which I'm going to write about in the newsletter, because I know you haven't seen that one yet. So yeah, we're going to stick to these two today that we both have seen. Yeah, it's funny because they really are stories about men and boys. They are about white male relationships, and particularly with Close, I think the context of socialization and the pressures that can bring in terms of what we understand of what masculinity is, in terms of how it's, how it's socialized into us as men. And then Godland, I think, takes a much more metaphysical, religious view, or puts it through that lens. But there's still, I think, kind of interesting things about what masculinity is in a historical sense in that movie. And then I think you're going to love The Eight Mountains. I think actually it's probably my favorite out of the three, just to sort of put that caveat there. So it'd be interesting to see what you make of that. But these two films we both enjoyed and felt were interesting to talk about. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have the same sort of sense of it, thinking about the two films in connection with each other.
Yeah, you mentioned that the other day, and after you'd sort of seen Godland, you sort of sent me a message, and I've been thinking about it, and I watched Close last night, so I was thinking about those connections, and they definitely feel there. It's hard, isn't it? Because in the sense that they are, films about white men. But what I felt they both did was take what, in both cases, have been stories that have been told many, many times, and through both the kind of the writing and the performances, I thought, justified going back. And there was so much nuance in those relationships that the films are centrally about, and the legacies of those relationships, that I kind of had that feeling coming out of both, being like, that you could easily say, oh, it's another film about white men's problems, but they both get at some of the things that still have not been sufficiently addressed and still cause so many problems in terms of male relationships. It's not like the things that these films about have been solved. So yeah, I thought they were both really interesting. And then what I thought was really interesting was the dynamics and how small moments can alter those relationships, and how we as men are fundamentally unprepared for dealing with that and resolving that. I think was really interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree totally with that. And that's why I did find them interesting, because I think both of them actually could have gone down a certain route that you would have gone, yeah, I've seen this before, and I know what's happening here, and I know what the outcome is going to be. And neither of them did. I think Close is particularly, you could make that argument about Close probably even more so, because it looks like it's going to be one film and then something happens and it never goes to where you might expect.
Yeah.
But I like what you said there in terms of that sense of, it's easy to come out of films like this, and like I said, there's a sort of there seems to be a cycle of films again that are going back to the sort of male experience, and it's not even, you could quite simply and easily say both of these films in some ways are coming of age. But I hate that phrase, because like almost every film with a child in it is coming of age. It's just par for the territory. You know what I mean? Because of the sort of narrative structures.
Yeah, aren't we always coming of age? Yeah, which I think is interesting, and it's because it's a genre term
of some kind of age, anyway.
Well, exactly. Like we're coming of our 40s and 50s, and dealing with all of the learned experiences that we have to navigate in order to try and live healthily in that time. So, but I can see the generic relationship between that and sort of films that do a certain thing. But yeah, it was interesting when you because when you mentioned that they were related, and I knew that Close was a kind of more traditionally badged coming of age movie, I thought back about Godland and thought, well, yeah, it is, because of the central protagonist's age being, and just not just like the physical age, but like, yeah, the experiential age of that person it's a huge awakening. It's almost more of an awakening than the religious awakening that they've had in order to enter the priesthood, which is, I think, really fascinating.
And I think the connection for me, it kind of reiterated my interest in being able to talk about men in film without an automatic reaction of oh God, it's just another film about men, like a hero film or an action film that's just about men doing men shit, you know what I mean? Or conversely, it's just another movie about how shitty men are, toxic masculinity, men in crisis, and all of that kind of stuff. Or these three positions, the third one being that here's a film that is going to be didactically progressive about how men should be. I think it's really hard to not fall into one of those three kinds of representations as a reaction to the kind of quote unquote discourse about masculinity being in crisis. And it's what's really interesting. I mean, and you know this because you know me, but like this is what my dissertation was about 20 years ago. So it's not as if this is a new thing in the last sort of 4 or 5 years. I think it's been kind of amplified, obviously because of things like social media, but everything has been amplified because of social media. It's always been there, but there seems to be now a much more clear pocket of or ecosystem of problematic masculine subjectivity that is leaking across from places where before the social media it would have been quite obscure and difficult to find, but now it's leaking into the mainstream an awful lot more. And society, culture, online and offline, and the commentariat, and social policy and all of that kind of thing, and education and familial structures haven't found a way to talk about it, let alone deal with it.
Yeah. What's been interesting are the things that I've read about both these films. No one's mentioned the fact that it's another film about white men, and it feels like they've both almost kind of subliminally responded to the challenge of the last few years, which is like, if you're going to tell these stories, don't do what you've said, like don't just rehash, don't just find ways to make these important stories and themes resonant and not feel like it's just taking up space with the same old crap. And I think both these films do that. And I think as a result have been really well received. Like no one's saying that we don't want these films. What people are saying, rightly so, is we don't want 1,000 films, 990 of which are just the same old navel-gazing, self-pitying stuff. And I think that was really refreshing, was being able to think, oh, actually, yeah, they seem to be responding in terms of the aesthetic demands and the kind of thematic kind of nuances of a time where just trolling out the same old crap is no longer acceptable. And that's great because, yeah, that good movies about all subjects are really important. And I think that we have gone through a period where certainly the kind of the art house and the mainstream drama have neglected that and sort of been sort of coasting for a while. So I think it feels like a resurgence in the right kinds of films, without being too.
Yeah. I think probably maybe the problem lies for people who are looking at this in the round and the film industry in the round might say, and I have some sympathy with this, that both the films that we're going to see today are prize winners at film festivals. So it's just kind of like more stories about boys and men winning prizes, and that feeds into also, what gets released, what gets distributed, what is commissioned, what can you see, and the discrepancy in equality of opportunity, really, in terms of female filmmakers being able to tell, or filmmakers of color being able to tell stories that get out there, and that I have a lot of sympathy with. But I think in this conversation we're just talking about the idea of the representation, because we're happy to cover that other subject, and we have done in the past quite a lot, haven't we? So shall I start with Close? I think we'll proceed that if we're going to give a spoiler, we'll let you know, but I think our audience particularly like to watch the films before they listen to us talk. So there may be some spoilers in there. Apologies if it does spoil it, but any of the big ones we'll let you know. So yeah, this is directed by Lukas Dhont in the follow-up to Girl from 2018. Have you seen that, Neil? Have you seen Girl?
No, this was the first of his I'd seen.
I don't think I've seen it, but I can't quite remember. I'm going to have to go back and revisit. And as you said, it won the Grand Prix in Cannes, which is the second prize. And it's the story of two 13-year-old boys, Leo and Remy, played by Eden Dambreen and Gustave de Weiler. I think you pronounce that. And they're kind of inseparable friends in a French parish. Let's say, it's a rural area. And what's interesting at the beginning of the film, that it represents their relationship as deeply intimate and sensitively affectionate for one another. There is no sort of rough and tumble in terms of the way that they act with each other. That there's a lot of physical intimacy, and the way that that's shot is their relationship to the space and each other and the camera is very, very close up. In fact, extreme close up is used throughout the film, particularly focusing on the face of Leo, who's got this very androgynous face, let's say, which I think that the camera plays on quite a lot. So in the very first scene that you see, they're doing the things that boys do, which is sort of play acting this war game scenario. They're in this kind of disused, abandoned building, which they're using as a kind of bunker, as it were. And you feel this sort of claustrophobia and darkness. But then this is immediately contrasted by dynamic tracking shots of them running through the fields of flowers. Leo's parents actually work on a flower farm. And that kind of ties into the sort of sensitivity of these two young male characters. They sleep in the same bed together, and without any real sort of comment or protest from the parents, nobody's criticizing for them that or looking at that as a problematic thing. And in fact, Remy's parents kind of accept Leo as a sort of surrogate son. So this carefree summer ends quite early on in the film, and they start middle school. And it's clear they initially kind of cling to each other for security in dealing with this new environment, particularly because the hierarchies of power and, the sort of need to self-define come quite quickly into force as soon as they go to this school. And then there's this key scene where Leo and Remy are talking with a group of girls who quiz them, asking the question quite pointedly, are you two together? Are you two a couple? And Leo rejects this, offhand. He's quite defensive about it. And then Remy stays almost silent and doesn't make a comment on it at all. As the film then progresses, you see Leo trying to kind of distance himself from Remy. This comment that these girls have made has been the triggering point for that. But then also you get the straightforward scenes in the playground of, a little bit of bullying about the fact that these two are together. And they are slightly outsiderish, they're not engaging in the much more male initiation playground antics. Remy, for example, is a musician, plays is it the oboe or the clarinet? And there's this very sort of emotional scene of Leo watching Remy play the clarinet, which is sort of played very much for its emotional resonance about their relationship, I think. So Leo looks to distance himself he joins the hockey team and tries to make friends with sort of some of the other boys. But there's this one moment when Leo fails to meet up with Remy, I think, before school one day. And it's like the first time. I mean, they've been distancing each other for a little while, but this one moment causes Remy to kind of confront Leo, and they get into a fight in the school. And Remy actually kind of has a kind of major meltdown, you know what I mean? He gets really hysterical, has to be separated off. This is the part where there is a spoiler, so if you don't want to know what happens next, then just maybe fast forward a little bit. But they go on a school trip, which Remy isn't on. He doesn't turn up for it. And then when they come back from this school trip, it turns out that Remy has committed suicide. So the rest of the film then is Leo playing out his reaction to this, which is obviously incredibly emotional, but wrapped with guilt because he feels like he's caused or been, at least partially to blame for Remy committing suicide. And he redevelops his relationship with Remy's mother as they both work through the grief of what's happened. And I think, just to round out there and give you a chance to speak now, because that was a fairly long monologue, I think that the interesting part for me in terms of the structure of the film, or why it's not a typical generic coming-of-age story, is it could have easily fallen into the story that you have seen a lot before, where there is an outsider of some kind who then deals with that self-identity and that outsiderism, whether it's to do with sexuality or whatever, and dealing with bullying and dealing with the school and with family and sort of coming through that. It doesn't do that. Yeah, and that the particular moment of the suicide changes the film quite dramatically into the second half and makes it a much more interesting watch, I think. Anyway, over to you, Neil. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I really liked it. It's interesting that pivotal moment does sort of shift the film, but you feel it in the first half, like in terms of whose point of view it is and where you're likely to end up. And what the film, I think, does really well is that you're never really sure what is going to shift and how the shift is going to take place. That you spend more time with Leo in his life than you do with Remy, and any time with Remy is spent with Leo attached. So you're aware that it's kind of Leo's coming of age story. But what's, I think, really well done is how, the film sort of creates the distance between the two by favouring Leo, and sort of putting you in his shoes much more, so that that you really feel those moments where the two friends start to separate, and it's always sort of making you question how you feel about their relationship. Like you say, like that nothing's ever commented on in the film, so it leaves it to you. Like, how do you feel about their relationship and what happens as it progresses through school, and the kind of the everyday cruelties of children start to pile up, and how they both separately respond to that, and you do get the impression that Leo is masking something with the ice hockey, trying desperately to find something which he feels uncomfortable about with Remy, which is why the blame that he puts on himself feels really authentic. You can just see how he blames himself because he's been making these decisions which have taken him further and further away throughout. And I think that the performance of the actor playing Leo is just fantastic. There's such a coiled energy to it, and just the ability to move through so many different emotional states. Like early on in the film, where he's sort of looking at Remy asleep, and you do get the sense that he's got an emotional connection to this person that he just doesn't understand, and it's there right off the bat. And then the politics of school just cause havoc. The way he carries the whole film on his face is just amazing. I loved it. Loved that performance.
It's really interesting because physically, I think Leo looks a bit like a Spielberg kid.
Yeah.
He reminded me of Elliot from E.T., and especially that moment where, that in it's like almost the same scene, except one is a major blockbuster and the other is an art house way of shooting, right? But the scene where he is watching Remy play the musical instrument in the concert, there's that sort of slow zoom up into the eyes, which is very reminiscent of what Spielberg does with that slow zoom in for awe and wonder. You're looking up and the kid is like looking at E.T. or whatever in like awe. And there's this sort of, it very much mirrors that aesthetically for me.
And I think as well, like it really leans into like Hollywood coming of age aesthetics in terms of them running through the cornfields and the flower fields and them on their bikes.
Yeah.
Like it's very happy to live in that space aesthetically. Yeah.
Yeah, and along those lines, that the internal, external spaces on the screen are shot and lit to emphasize those mood changes. It very much puts you as a viewer in the mood of sorrow and mood of happiness and lightness. So, I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to call it on the nose, but it's very much using the sort of symbolism of light and dark and movement and stillness to portray the moods of the characters. And that's fine. I didn't find that annoying or anything like that. It worked. As well as those things do. The other thing that really struck me was how it linked to this idea, or it really put a lens on this idea of the loss of innocence. And it was just making me think. I was writing some notes yesterday. I was just thinking, most of our loss of innocence is kind of takes place over time and slowly. It's like watching this film, I can't remember what it was like to be carefree as a 13-year-old kid and not have any, you know what I mean? It's like that feeling is long gone. And sometimes you can sort of nostalgically maybe project back onto it when you see a film like this, right? But in this case, it's ruptured in an instant, and you suddenly have this moment where the kid is no longer has to deal with grief. He's no longer a child. He has to understand or try and deal with his own human emotions, but also his relationship with the mother of Remy, which is about somebody blaming you, the friend's death, and the mother comes into it kind of more at the end, and that sense of how she reacts to him is harsh at the beginning, and it leads to something of a set-piece ending, which I didn't quite buy. It wasn't quite in keeping with the rest of the film, I thought, the ending, but that's by the by. that whole sense of where does innocence go? And I think the film does a really interesting job of giving you a dramatic moment of rupture so that the kid has to deal with it, which is interesting to watch, but also reminding you of, yeah, we all felt this way when we were kids to a certain degree. And then we go through, for all of us in a very different way, a sort of transitional phase into adulthood. And that innocence sort of seeps away,
But I think what I really liked about that was how weirdly does what we were sort of talking about at the start of the episode, like into non-film stuff, which is there are moments where he is able to be carefree. Like there's the snowball fight, and then there's the end of term party, where I think in other films you would see him unable to enjoy that with a kind of innocence of childhood, which I think that's something, one of the really interesting things is it's saying, look, yeah, he is kind of like really engaged in this period of grief and he has had his life ruptured. There are still moments of joy possible. And that's something that seems increasingly difficult to hold on to as we progress into adulthood, is that these states exist side by side. And it is a loss of innocence, but I think a lot of films kind of say that it's a complete loss of innocence. Like you're going to be, a different person, as in unable to experience those things. And I love it because there was a real friction there in terms of one minute he's just lashing out at school and the next minute he's having a great time. And it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of what life is like. But we do, like you say, what do we cling on to as adults? We probably remember the humiliations and the embarrassments way more than we remember those times where it was just completely perfect.
Yeah, and I think that it just sort of made me think about the narrative that we tell ourselves about our own childhood and how that's turned us into the person that we are. And that in itself is oftentimes just a narrative, isn't it? You know what I mean? It's kind of like how we justify the way that we are as we get older. And again, I think one of the other things for me that was interesting was the way the film constructed that sense of their potential relationship and what the labels of that were going to be for anyone on the outside. Because even before they get to the school, the camera and the director using the camera and the cinematography is very knowing about what it's telling us about, or what it's offering us in terms of our interpretation of what this relationship could be. In some ways, you could say it may be constructing a sense of provocative representation to allow us to say, oh, that's very intimate. You know what I mean? There's something going on here. But when you think about it, it reminds us just how much we're socialized now to sort of put labels on things, right? Oh, they must be kind of, homosocial in some way, even if they're not understanding what it is. And yet, when they get to the school, and the school is obviously the major socialization kind of context for all of us, then suddenly the labels come thick and fast, you know what I mean? And they have to deal with them. And it's just great because when you sort of deconstruct that, you can sort of say to yourself, yeah, we put these things onto relationships, and particularly, I think, boys, and put the barriers on them very quickly. Like we label that and we say, and depending what kind of parent you are or what kind of person you are, you'd be like, no, I don't like that. I don't want my kid behaving that way. And this is, as you're watching, you can tell that the director is offering you the potential to put your own prejudices or your own socialized way of thinking onto what this relationship could be. And that's really interesting.
Yeah, I felt very similar watching it. Yeah, like, kind of constantly questioning my own perception of what their relationship is. And yeah, I thought that was really well done, in the film. Yeah. And just, yeah, I flinched when you said about the narratives we tell ourselves as children and that we tell other people about our childhood, because I'm definitely going through a lot of that right now. And the film definitely made me think that, in terms of like how I have created a narrative of my childhood, which is not as truthful about my experiences that, as it really was. And it did make me think like, how will this figure in Leo's adult life? Like, what will he do with this? Where does he end up emotionally? And I think that because of the way the film moves through the relationship he has with Remy and then the relationship he has on his own and with the mother and with the ice hockey as well, which I think is such a fascinating, uber masculine in terms of its iconography, certainly. Yeah, just how's he going to get on, And there's a couple of lovely scenes with adult men doing things which are just really touching, which didn't feel like that thing where you were saying, which I think is true, which is like, this is how men should be. Like, you know, it's a very realistic portrayal of masculine inability to express emotion and console and talk, you know. But there's a scene where he's with a doctor, and there's a scene with like Remy's dad where you just feel like, men trying to do something which just doesn't come very naturally, and then the awkwardness and the discomfort that causes everybody when that happens. You know, that we as a society is still not, you know, we say we want men to be more vulnerable, we say more emotional, more tactile, but it's like when it actually happens and we see it, it causes a great discomfort. And I thought that was really beautifully handled in the film.
There's a social awkwardness about it.
Mm. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, when we sort of burst into tears in the middle of the table, everybody's just like, instead of sort of, you know, really rallying round, everybody's just sort of sat there quietly, you know. But you know, I mean, it's very good on that. It's very good.
Well, to tell a personal story on that, that happened to me, recently, where I was out with a couple of friends, one woman and one man, and you know, life was just got the better of me, and instead of bottling it up like I used to, we were in this like a Greasy Spoon cafe, and I just burst into tears, and was consoled by the woman who's a good friend, and I just knew I was making the man uncomfortable, and he just didn't know what to do. You know, it was, and I was thinking to myself like, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't, you know, because I'm making someone else uncomfortable. But it's like, Jesus Christ, I can't do that. You know, like I cannot do this anymore. But yeah, just that sense of social awkwardness is so loud when you have those feelings and you're in a public space, or you cannot get through stuff. And I just thought, that I wondered how the film would do that, because there's a moment after Remy dies where you don't see the dad, and then again you have these assumptions. Oh well, this obviously what's happened is him and the wife have split up, because that's what always happens. The grief is too much. The reminder is too much, so they're not together. But that's not what happens. And then it reveals something else, which I think was much more interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So shall we move on to Godland? Both of these films are available to stream. So if you're listening to this and you haven't caught them yet, then you can do that fairly easily. Neil, why don't you give us your summary of Godland?
So Godland tells the story of Lukas, who is a young Danish priest, and he's sent to Iceland to kind of build a church for Danish exiles, or, you know, sort of people displaced by a volcano. So there's this kind of remote part of Iceland where people are going to end up because of a volcanic eruption, and he is sent to sort of bring God and Christianity to this part of Iceland. And he's sent by sort of the church elder on an absolutely ridiculous journey to travel across Iceland to get to know the land and its people, so that when he arrives in this kind of small hamlet, essentially tiny little place, he's kind of familiar with the place that he'll be spending his life. So he kind of embarks on this journey, and he's given a guide, this kind of Icelandic, sort of part Danish guide called Ragnar, who's a kind of, you know, man of the land, and Ragnar's team sort of help Lukas traverse the landscape to this tiny little sort of cliff top hamlet. And what's really interesting about the film, I think, is that it's not just about the journey. So it's, you know, that the journey has its own symbolism and its own kind of thematic resonance, but it's also about what happens when he gets there, kind of after this journey. So the film is essentially split into two, with the journey to the small village, and then life in the small village as the kind of church is built, and sort of, you know, preparing for the coming of God and winter at the same time, which kind of really interestingly sort of poised. The journey that they take is absolutely kind of grueling, but it's mostly grueling for Lukas. So the locals who kind of guide him, you know, feel they are much less troubled by the extremities and the sheer sort of hellishness of the weather. But Lukas, as can be sort of imagined, has a much more difficult time with what was ahead of him, and it takes a toll that sort of runs out across the remainder of the film. And what's really interesting is that even in this tiny little place, he sort of is greeted by a form of civilization. There is a patriarchal culture, there are sort of romantic interests, and there is kind of, work to be done. And he's just completely changed by his journey and unable to be a member of this community in any kind of functional way. After I watched it, the film I really wanted to watch straight, or sort of, very close, was Lucretia Martel's Zama, which I did. And it was really interesting because it felt very similar in its kind of tale of these men in these places where they have been sent and they think they're on a mission to do something grand. But what is slowly revealed is that they've basically been sent there to get them out of the way. And the sort of the emotional toll that takes. It's interesting that in Zama, the main character, Zama, is sort of constantly referred to as a functionary. And here there's a kind of almost derogatory way that people call Lukas the priest. They have a role which is not seen as very significant. No one really cares. They are there to perform duties which keep the fabric of the community going, but there's no real investment in them as people or their role as of any significance, which I think is kind of jarring when you get to this place and you assume that they're going to welcome God into the community in this kind of big grand way, and it's nothing like that at all. So yeah, it's a really beautifully shot film and kind of uses photography as a starting point as well. So Lukas is a photographer, and in the earliest days of sort of plate photography, and kind of carries the equipment needed to do that with him on his journey, and it just becomes such a obvious but powerful metaphor for the weight that he's carrying, and the kind of his sense of identity and a sense of like the importance that he places on his own journey. But it's also kind of ridiculous, and that's the last thing to say, is it's a really funny film, and like Zama, is just so tuned into the absurdities of these kinds of crusade or colonial projects as anything other than just the folly of white men in power. That it's got a really beautiful absurdist streak, and the relationship between Ragnar and Lukas is where the film has its kind of emotional center, and that becomes a really fascinating relationship, because when they get to the village, Ragnar stays. He stays to help build the church, but also stays because he's actually seeking something which feels very emotionally real, but because of his life and because of the situation that they all find themselves in, it's completely impossible for him to achieve. So yeah, I hope that covers it. Dario, what do you think?
This film looks amazing. I mean, it's Academy ratio, isn't it? It's 4:3, but honestly, you would struggle to watch something that's more cinematic this year, I would say. And what was interesting, I was sat right at the front of the cinema, and so I was looking up quite a bit, and I think I just moved because somebody was rustling popcorn. But I was looking up, and you get a lot of these shots. Again, it's all the vistas and the amazing landscape of Iceland. But there's a lot of shots of water as well, the rivers that they're crossing. There's this one scene where they're crossing a river, and the water, they're actually crossing at the top. It reminded me of the Fabelmans, that last scene where they said, you've got to put the horizon either at the top or the bottom, but never in the middle, you know what I mean? So the horizon was at the top, and all the water was sort of cascading down the screen, and it really felt like, you were being sort of submerged in this water, just from a sort of, as much as you can be when you're sat there in an auditorium. But it just made me think so much how, when we talk about the idea of cinematic spectacle, and that's almost always associated with big budget CGI explosions. This is so formally rigorous. I mean, again, sometimes it's damning with fake praise to say every scene could be a painting, but it's like it is. Every scene is a moving painting. That ties in, I think, as well to the sort of the staginess of the photography in the film as a theme. That idea that you've got to kind of sit there for a long time and not make a move while Lukas sort of takes the lens cap off and then puts it back on, and he's got to paint their faces with this sort of white powder so that they show up, and the whole sort of falseness of that. It's kind of ironic, it doesn't do this explicitly, but the the dichotomy between, on the one hand, you've got all this nature and yet here's this guy trying to record it as if it was authentic, and he's completely staging all of these scenarios, which is really interesting. The cinematographer is called Maria von Hauswolf, and I hadn't really seen anything that she'd done before, but this is as good as anything I've seen, in terms of the camera positioning as much as anything else. And it really is a fascinating juxtaposition with the Eight Mountains when you see that film, Neil, because again, that's landscape. There's lots of mountains and what have you, but that's much more of a freeform camera that's sort of moving around, a much more kind of classical sense of capturing the landscape, which is reminded me a lot of Westerns, really, where this is kind of very European. It's very much in the sort of Bergman, or Michael Haneke sort of shooting of the outdoors, let's say. But yeah, just beyond that, it reminded me of so many films. And again, I hate doing that thing where it's like, oh, if you like this, you'll like that. And I don't mean it in that way. But in terms of the encroachment of modernity and the idea of what photography symbolized, it really reminded me of Unrest. Like here you have the colonial project, and a lot of that is to do with the technology that is becoming available. In terms of the sort of passages of time, because you get these moments where the film almost pauses and does... It's not really... it's a variation of time lapse, but they shoot the same scene over periods of time to show that time is progressing. And it reminded me a little bit of a ghost story in that sense, that we're all sort of so minute in the vastness and sort of limitlessness of time. I think that was really interesting. And the stuff that you said there about the craziness of this journey. And yeah, I think Zama is a really good shout, but it just reminded me of Herzog as well, stuff like A Gear, Wrath of God, that type of stuff. And even the piano, I think it's quite, there's some similarities to that as well, about sort of transporting all of this modernist paraphernalia from one place to another, which is crazy. Yeah, and it's interesting as well, because the main character, Lukas, is not a very likable character. As you've highlighted, that relationship with Ragnar is really interesting, because you get the three positions, don't you? You've got the sort of Ragnar represents the sort of mythical man of nature, but he never sort of assumes that position of sort of taking Lukas in hand and being nice to him. And you get this language barrier throughout. And it's funny because through the film, they're both learning each other's language a little bit, but they're refusing to understand each other. It's kind of comical where they are speaking each other's language, but they have this sentence that is like, I still don't understand what you're saying. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, it doesn't matter whether you've learned your language. I still don't I'm not going to understand you. Because it's kind of like fundamentally that Lukas sees Ragnar as a sort of, as a peasant, really, for want of a better word. And Lukas is very much a snob. But within Lukas, you get this character who has this battle between religion, and his crisis of faith. And it's not really even a crisis. He's just annoyed, I think, that God has sent him there. God in the form of the church at the beginning of the movie. But he doesn't really question his faith, like, overtly. It's more like, why have you sent me out here? I don't get it. This is awful, you know what I mean? Which is kind of amusing, I found. But it's a film that I really, really admired, rather than absolutely loving on an emotional level, especially after seeing The Eight Mountains, which I absolutely kind of adored, and I sort of it really spoke to me, like on a subjective level. Whereas this, I was just like, this is amazingly well done from start to finish, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it did make me think of a number of films, and it made me want to watch some of those again, like Fitzcarraldo, particularly, and the Viggo Mortensen film from a few years ago, Huaha, which has a similar kind of ratio. That's really good. And again, kind of, just these really interesting ways of critiquing these kind of, colonial projects or the Crusades project. The photography in this, apparently, the cinematography is a nod to the photography. So it's the same ratio as the photographs, which works really, really well. And there's a lovely moment, where you're watching him set up a shot for ages and ages, and there's a subject in it. There's like someone that he's traveling with, and then he's just like, no, and you just don't even see him take the photo. There's a lot of those kinds of frustrations, and what becomes clear is that he's trying to impose a kind of order on this chaos, and he can't do it. I also like the bit where he gets to the village and he meets the sort of the father. So he meets the father of these two daughters, who has two daughters, who's kind of raising, and he is the kind of the patriarch of the village. He's seen as the kind of the person who's sort of in cultural control of everything. And he just sort of says to him, like plainly, while he's kind of nonchalantly sucking on his pipe, just says, well, why didn't you sail here? You know, and he's like, like at that point, he's like, yeah, I mean, he knows that it was a ridiculous thing to have done. But again, he's kind of, and that's the position that changes, isn't it? He's driven by a sense of duty at the start. He's young and eager, and his elder really sells it to him that he's the person to do this. And by the time he gets there, he's like, no, they just wanted me to, I was probably the only person who could have survived it, but it's a completely unnecessary thing. Yeah, he's shifted that. And that was what was interesting, was it was a film about bringing Christianity to a place where they kind of know what it is, and they've had a form of it, or they've had it in their old place, and they just want it to be part of their routine. They're not overly invested in, it's not kind of like taking it to a place where there's this kind of idea that they're sort of primitive natives who need to be cultured and civilized. It's like, well, we just need someone to give mass on a Sunday, and his realization that that's all he is devastating to him, because it just, he's done all of this, and what's he done it for? Nothing. He's not appreciated. The father, is worried that he's going to run off with one of his daughters, so would rather he wasn't even there at all. Takes a real dislike to him because of that. Like there's so many kind of little bits of politics which are really interestingly handled. And then it does take a kind of shift. I won't give a spoiler, but there are kind of things which, if you're attuned to the film, don't feel like a surprise, but are still quite shocking. One particular moment that's still quite shocking. And I think what shocked me about it was that it's between Lukas and Ragnar, and at that point you've kind of realized that Ragnar is the most emotionally complex and interesting and actually probably sympathetic character that you come across, which is so unexpected from the first time you meet him, which I think is really well done. And the other thing it reminded me of, there's a great film, like a short film called Eki Mook, which is by Nick Abrams. It was for a Sigur Rós project, and it's got that really kind of slow time-lapse sense of nature and man together, and the relationship between the two and how tenuous it is. And there's a great use of time-lapse in terms of the passing of, and that's the other thing I do want to say, is like time passes in such strange ways in this film. Like at the start he says, you've got to get there before winter, and then they're on this journey for what feels like 4 years, so many seasons, so many different types of weather conditions, and it changes overnight, and it's really disorienting. And that's probably true to what Iceland's like. I've no idea, I've not been, but it gives you the sense of like, when are we, and how for the people who live there, they traverse that perfectly naturally, and they leave it unscathed. But Lukas cannot do it. And then these other sort of lapses of time where the kind of film steps out of its linear narrative time and just sort of spends time, as you say, with watching time change, even though in the narrative time has not passed at all. It's really beautifully done. I love those moments. There's one with his horse that he loves that disappears, and then there's one at the very end where you think it's been 10 years, but really it's only been, in the narrative, a month or two. And that's really well done in terms of, the sense of time. And again, just really cinematic, just able to use cinematic time in really, really interesting ways.
On the time thing, I think sometimes we get locked into the idea of, there's linear storytelling, and then there's chopping up linear storytelling and reorganizing it. But the basis is still linear. Whereas here, it is very clever because it takes you out of the linearity almost entirely, and then drops you back in. But when you're dropped back in, you're not necessarily in the same place as you were before, so it's very well done in that sense. And I guess, again, that's another allusion to the sort of capturing of the image, as a sort of that moment in time that was one place, it happened at that moment, but then is ephemeral, is both history and his future. It's a very interesting sort of philosophical take on the idea of the photograph in that sense. And there's some great, again, not to sort of overly spoil it, but as it gets towards the end, the denouement of the church being built becomes this hilarious scene of it all just going massively badly wrong, and then turning very much, from comedy to tragedy. So it does sort of tap into those key elements of storytelling. And yeah, just a fascinating piece of work. Like I say, I think Unrest is another good companion piece, because you think, oh wow, this is doing some really interesting things here without wearing it on its sleeve necessarily in a very ostentatious way, you know?
Yeah, form and content seem very much like they're working with each other to kind of, in productive ways. Yeah, that's a really good shout on Rest. I think that's a nice companion piece.
Great. So I think we'll leave it there and head over to the bonus episode. So please come along and join us for some extra film chat. I know that Neil has seen various things, and so have I, and we can sort of talk about those. So yeah, we've got a few more episodes to come before the end of the season. Neil, you've got one coming up on a Japanese dystopian film called Plan 75, which I'm very much looking forward to, because that film looks great. And there's an event that you're going to compare a screening on that, which will be great for the podcast. Yeah, also in the bonus, I'm looking forward to hearing about your burgeoning friendship with Laura Mulvey. That should be interesting. But great to see you again. Good to talk. Always nice to do these episodes. It's always great fun to do the deep dives.
Yeah, really nice. Yeah, great to chat to you. A small tonic, given that it can't be in person. And I'm looking forward to the bonus to find out about your misadventure to see, which I guess was Plan 75, which you were planning to see.
It was, yeah. Yeah, so the plan failed for Plan 75.
Plan 76.
Yeah, Plan 76 is next week. Yeah, so that is it for this episode of Cinematologist Podcast. If you want to contact us in all the usual places, we are there. Our email is cinematologist@gmail.com. You can contact our handles on Instagram and Twitter. Any comments on the previous episode, indeed, on the audio documentary on cinema and psychiatry, or indeed this one, please get in touch. I've had some interesting points to discuss on there, which is always nice. But until next time, this has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.